Hello, my friends, and welcome to the Two Trees Podcast. I'm John Dillon, and I am here today with Ted Wright from epicarchaeology.org. And Ted has a passion for the ancient world, has a passion for history and archaeology, and his site has just tons of fantastic information that's going to make the Old Testament and the world of the prophets come alive. And so, Ted, thank you so much for coming on to the podcast today.
John, thank you for having me on. It's an honor to be with you today. Yeah, great to be here.
Well, tell us a little bit about yourself, brother.
Well, I started out as a graphic design major, interestingly enough, and then went to the U.S. Air Force. I got out and decided I wanted to get a degree in ancient history. And then I had a pastor friend of mine. One night, it was a Sunday night, I'll never forget it. He actually took me to his office and he said, "Hey, I think you may like these." And it was a big stack of Biblical Archaeology Review magazines. Some of your listeners may be familiar with that and may subscribe to it. So I had never even seen it before, but I took it home and I went through about 2 or 3 issues, and I knew this is exactly what I wanted to do. So I immediately changed my major from ancient history to archaeology. And I was already a believer at the time, so this sort of dovetailed in with my passion. And I didn't really have any of the answers, I didn't really know any of the, I just assumed that there was archaeological evidence for the Exodus and the conquest and, the Bible, the biblical record. And I didn't realize all the debates that were going on. And then I ended up getting my undergraduate degree in anthropology and archaeology at Mississippi State University. At the Cobb Institute of Archaeology. As it turns out, the director of the Cobb Institute was an archaeologist by the name of Dr. Joe Sager, and Dr. Sager was a colleague and a friend of Bill Deaver, and those two guys are really two very important figures in American biblical archaeology. They attended Harvard University and studied under Frank Cross, who was a student of William F. Albright. So they were directly influenced by the Albright, Wright, not me, but G.E. Wright method of biblical archaeology. So I already at the outset in my undergrad had a really great introduction to ancient Near Eastern archaeology. And so I graduated and eventually went to Southern Evangelical Seminary, which is where I have my master's degree. And studied under Norm Geisler. Absolutely, it is. Studying under Dr. Norman Geisler, and it was sort of a natural match to join my passion for archaeology with apologetics to look at the archaeological and historical background of the Old Testament and New Testament. And so I had personal questions as to where the Bible came from and the historical background that led me down a lot of rabbit trails and a lot of weeds. And I know that your podcast, you guys like to get into the weeds a lot. So I've just been astounded at the material that is out there. And we live in an amazing time in the world, sad time in a lot of reasons, but also a very exciting time because there's incredible amounts of archaeological evidence and historical evidence that what you hold in your hand as the Old and New Testament is an incredibly reliable document written by eyewitnesses. I'm convinced that everything we see, every story is true. But of course, the most important thing is context. And so maybe today we can get into that, looking at context and understanding these biblical stories in their original historical and cultural context and how archaeology can help us to see that.
I love that idea of putting yourself in the context of the ancient world. And there's never been a better time for a student of the Bible to be alive than right now. You click a button
Absolutely.
And you're there. There is so much information and so much great scholarship that's been put into these things. And I just sent you an email and you were like, yeah, I'll come talk about that. And so if you want to do that, you can do that too. So I'm telling you guys, you're only limited by your interest. If you're fascinated with a topic, you're hearing it from your pastors and from other places too as well. But dig into that, man. Lean into your interests and let the Bible stories just teach you and show you, because there's so much here that's way beyond just the morality of the story. Yes, is there a lesson for you here?
Absolutely.
For sure, but it really happened in the ancient world, and there's so much detail to fall in love with and to really dig in. You said the weeds a minute ago, and I love the weeds. That's where, when I golf, I love the weeds as well. I like to get off of the fairway and just really enjoy the trees on the edges. But yeah, man, I am fascinated with this. And honestly, the further back in time you go, the more interesting things are to me. But you have kind of been part of our podcast a little bit because you put out these really great photographs and a little bit of a history blurb just to kind of capture attention on a specific idea. What caused you to think, what would be a really great outreach is just this format? I guess it goes back to your design background a little bit. When did you start doing that?
That's a great insight, Aki. You're right, John. It actually does. I am a stickler. I love great design, and a lot of Christian art and a lot of Christian graphics are sort of cheesy, and so I wanted to have something. I was trying to think of what exactly could we do in the world of social media to get across biblical truth that's shareable, that's accurate, that gives you accurate historical information in a shareable format. And I looked around and I found a couple of websites, especially in Europe. And the British Museum has a really great website. They have all their artifacts listed. They're searchable databases. And so I was influenced by multiple different areas. Also, in my undergraduate days, one of my professors, an archaeologist by the name of Dr. Paul Jacobs, pioneered, this is back years ago, this is back in the middle to late 90s. Paul Jacobs pioneered something in archaeology called digital, it was called the Digmaster database. Basically, it was digitally photographing artifacts and putting them online and doing a three-dimensional image so that people could spin them around. Now, I'd love to have that. I don't have that capability right now. But archaeologists from around the world, if they wanted to look at a dig, they could actually manipulate these images in a three-dimensional context. Oh. And now that's used in a more common basis. So that was influenced by that. So I thought, what's a way we could do that? And so I call these artifact graphics. And they're basically like a little snapshot of an artifact, a biblical artifact that shows that the biblical story, it's some kind of insight into a biblical story. And so we provide some historical and archaeological context for when it was discovered, where it was discovered, and how it relates to the Old or New Testament. And the most recent one that we posted just this morning was actually discovered and a lot of these artifacts were discovered many years ago. A lot of the great discoveries are in museums, but this one turns out to be in the Penn Museum at the University of Pennsylvania, and it was excavated by a British archaeologist by the name of Sir Leonard Woolley. And Woolley excavated the ancient site of Ur in southern Mesopotamia. This is the same Ur that Abraham that we know in the Old Testament. He was born in Ur of the Chaldees according to the Old Testament. And what's fascinating is that this artifact is an actual ram caught in a thicket, caught in a briar thicket, and by its horns. And this statue was discovered in the what Leonard Woolley called the Royal Tomb Archive, or the Royal Tomb at Ur, and so this motif of the ram caught in a thicket seems to indicate that, according to the ancient Mesopotamians, that an important decision is about to be made. And so what's fascinating to me about that is how that sort of does parallel what we see with Abraham. And Abraham is from Ur of the Chaldees. Now, am I saying Abraham, the biblical writers, stole that idea and maybe used it? No, I'm not saying that. I'm saying is that the biblical story is entrenched in the context of the time in which it was written, and may have even had even more meaning to Abraham than even we fully understand. And there's a lot of other examples in the Old Testament as well that we can talk about. But the ram caught in the thicket was a motif in Mesopotamian culture that indicated a decision. And of course, the decision was Abraham going to sacrifice his son, and God provided a lamb. And one of the things that and this gets into a little bit of the weeds here, since it's okay to do that on this podcast. But when it comes to the Old Testament, really there are two basic approaches you can take when it comes to looking at the ancient Near East and looking at ancient Eastern cultures and the Old Testament. One is called the comparative approach, in which scholars will compare the similarities between, so for instance, the Egyptians and the story in the Exodus. How are they alike?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, that's the comparative approach. And now it does look at differences, but the primary focus on the comparative approach is looking at the similarities. The other view, another view that I would say is, for me, even more powerful, is something called a polemical view. People may be familiar with John Walton's work. Walton is a comparative scholar, and so he's done some really interesting work, some really enlightening things. But in my opinion, I think that the polemical approach is actually the one that I prefer, and that is it looks at not only how the biblical stories are alike these other ancient Near Eastern stories, but how are they different? And how does biblical writers use these stories in a different way? And the polemical approach essentially is the idea that the biblical writers often utilize stories that were found in the ancient Near East while infusing them with completely new meaning. And they were, and the polemical angle from the biblical writers is that the biblical writers are vehemently monotheistic. There are no other gods. Yahweh is the true God, and he is the one true God, and he is the one. I'll give you an example. So, for instance, one example that people will be very familiar with is the story in the Old Testament where Elijah confronts the prophets, the Baal prophets. Remember that episode?
Uh-huh.
And he's confronting them, and people may or may not be aware, some of your listeners probably are aware, that Baal, or as it's, I think, correctly pronounced, Baal, we're just going to say Baal because it's easier to say, but Baal was actually a Canaanite fertility god, and he was literally, in all these Ugaritic texts, he was the god of thunder and lightning. He ascribed to himself the god of thunder and lightning. The reason why this was important is because, of course, a rainstorm or a thunderstorm would fertilize the crops because when you have thunder and lightning and clouds, we know now scientifically that produces nitrogen in the rain. It makes the grass grow, it makes the crops grow. But to the ancient Canaanites, they ascribed that to Baal. And when then Elijah steps forward and he calls to God, he said, "Let the true God answer by fire." So the polemical angle would say that the biblical writers are they're not stealing the Canaanite Baal myth. They're saying, you Canaanites are claiming that Baal is the true lightning god, but let me show you who the true lightning god is. He's the one who actually does things. And and of course, the story, the lightning falls from heaven, burns up the entire altar, and then, as Paul Harvey says, and now you know the rest of the story. But in any case, that's an example. And then in Egypt as well, there's a lot of other examples. So,
I think it's so important for a Bible student or someone studying their Bible today to not imagine that the Bible is a modern book. I think we're so fascinated with creativity and individuality in our culture that we have missed the power of what God is doing in the Old Testament by engaging in the conversations that were taking place then in such a way that they become timeless. And so, the ram in the thicket motif. Is that something that Abraham would have seen in Ur? Well, okay, if he did, he's seeing it in real life now. That whole concept of true myth becomes alive. That, it just is such a wonder when you begin to realize that God isn't just bringing about some new thing, but he's engaging with real people in the real world in a real way. It's so cool.
In their time, in their culture. He's speaking to them through their culture that they would have understood. And there are so many examples. When I first started studying this several years ago, I was like, the first two examples that I studied were really interesting. But I've since discovered that the Old Testament is actually filled with these examples of God communicating in the culture and the time of the people. So, as you know, I'm sure you probably have taught this. You're a pastor and a teacher. The three most important rules in hermeneutics are context, context, context.
Amen.
Of course, the linguistic context, the languages, the culture, and the history. Before we want to figure out what it means to us, we first have to understand what did it mean to the original audience. That's number one most important thing, because it's not until we understand what it meant to them then we can apply it to what it means to us and extract those timeless principles that don't change from generation to generation. But God does still speak. But back then, he spoke through the cultures of these ancient Eastern, civilizations. Let me give you one other example, if it's okay,
Oh, yeah.
unless you have another question. I'm not sure. I've got a couple of artifacts with me here. I've got one is a replica, and the other one is actually the real thing. First, I'll show you the real thing here. It's really, really tiny. This example, I'm going to hold it to the camera there. This is, folks can see it there. It's a scarab.
Oh, wow.
So it looks like a little beetle.
Yeah.
This is actually dates to the Ptolemaic period, so the time of the Ptolemies. You can see there the hieroglyphic inscription on the back.
Mm-hmm.
So this is an actual scarab from Egypt, and of course, just to give you a little context for what the Ptolemaic period is, from the Ptolemies. So after the death of Alexander the Great in about 323 BC in Babylon, all the kingdoms that Alexander the Great conquered were fought over by his generals. And one of the generals that became in charge of Egypt was a general by the name of Ptolemy, spelled with a P. It's the PT, Ptolemy. And he established the Ptolemaic rulers in Egypt. And eventually his great, however long it goes, granddaughter was Cleopatra. She was actually descended from the first Ptolemaic ruler in Egypt. So it was a time in which the Greeks, from the time of about 323 BC all the way into the time, actually we know the time, it's 31 BC when Cleopatra and her ally, Mark Antony, their naval forces were defeated at the Battle of Actium in 31 BC. So from the time of that, so this scarab dates to that time period. This is exact replica, a faience replica of a scarab that would have been carved. And of course, again, you got the hieroglyphic inscription on the back. Now, what in the world is this artifact, and what does this mean? Well, to the ancient Egyptians, a scarab actually dates back to the very earliest periods in Egyptian history, even before the Ptolemies. In fact, this little artifact actually can give us insight, when we understand the full historical context of this, can give us insight into the story of the Exodus, and specifically into the story of the plagues in Egypt. We read in the Exodus account all the plagues that came upon Egypt. Throughout the plague narratives in the book of Exodus, the scripture alternates back and forth, but the text, the weight of the text seems to indicate that Pharaoh hardened his heart, or that God hardened his heart. So there's an interplay between those phrases. The idea is the Pharaoh's heart is getting hard and harder and harder. So as each plague descends on Egypt, the Pharaoh's heart is getting heavier and heavier and heavier. Well, in 1799, a very important discovery was made in Egypt, in Rashid, Egypt, which we know as Rosetta. And this was the famous Rosetta Stone. It was discovered by Napoleon Bonaparte's one of his lieutenants. They were reinforcing a French fort there, and discovered this huge it wasn't trilingual necessarily, but it was a three-part inscription, same language, but in different scripts. On the bottom, you had Greek. In the middle, you had a language a script called Demotic, and which is a sort of a longhand cursive version of hieroglyphics. So you have hieroglyphics, you have Demotic, and you have Greek. So it was captured actually by the British when they blockaded the port of Alexandria, and Napoleon went back to France, and then it went to the British Museum, which is where it is today, and a race went forth to see who's going to decipher it first. At first, it was a British guy by the name of Thomas Young, and Young was a polymath, a brilliant guy, and he was a little bit older and was pretty much he was sort of like the Elon Musk of the day, and he was really smart, and everybody like, oh, Thomas Young is going to be the one to decipher it. But it was actually a young Frenchman by the name of Jean-Francois Champollion. You have to say the French, to say croissant. And anyway, so he deciphered it. So why do I go into all this detail? Because it was not until we understood hieroglyphics and how to read and translate hieroglyphics that we can now understand the symbolism and the meaning behind these little scarabs, and not only the scarabs, but also the temples in Egypt, the pyramids, all these different things. And so when I say we, I mean collectively archaeologists, Egyptologists working in Egypt for the past 150 years or so, what they discovered is a huge body of text inscriptions, not only in papyri, but also in temple walls, at Luxor, in tombs, on sarcophagi, on various things. They discovered this group of texts known collectively as the Egyptian Book of the Dead. The technical title of this collection of writings is called the Book of Going Forth by Day. That's what the Egyptians called it. And it's now known, people now, you might hear the Egyptian Book of the Dead. That was actually from the German translation called the Totenbuch, or the Death Book. But it's technically, the Egyptians believe that this was a collection of magical spells intended to ensure your soul would actually get into the afterlife and get into heaven in the afterlife. And John, do you know what? One of the most important things which determined whether or not the soul or the ba or the ka, there are two different things in the Egyptian anthropology. The ba was the personality, the ka was the soul. And so, but the thing that ensured the person's soul survived the afterlife was the heart. And the heart was actually, and we've discovered this in paintings and papyri, in the Book of the Dead, the heart is actually going to be weighed in the scale balances. There are actually pictures of this, and there's pictures online with Epic Archaeology, and essentially you have an Egyptian god of the dead called Anubis, and he is standing in the divine council with all the Egyptian gods. They're overseeing this entire scene, and the heart of the pharaoh is going to be weighed against the balance of a hieroglyphic. It's typically in a hieroglyphic feather, an ostrich feather. Sometimes it's portrayed as, it looks like a little statue of a goddess. This is called Ma'at, M-A-A-T. Ma'at was a goddess that was important in the Egyptian cosmology because she was the goddess of order. When the world was created, according to the Egyptians, the world was in chaos, and Ma'at brought order, divine order, and justice and truth to the universe. And she's represented as a feather sometimes, and sometimes as a little statue of a female with a feather on her head. That's Ma'at. And so interestingly, in the narrative of the Exodus, Pharaoh is not keeping Ma'at. Egypt is in complete chaos. The frogs are out of control. The Nile is out of control. Of course, we know also from Egyptian text that he would have been praying to the Egyptian gods to regain control of all these forces that were being unleashed in the plagues. And then finally, the final plague was the plague of the death of the firstborn, and this was another thing that we see in the Exodus account. But let me get back to the scarab here real quick. So what this is, and what the importance of this, was that this actually had these little scarabs here, had little prayers from the Book of the Dead that were intended to keep the heart soft. And when archaeologists excavating mummies in Egypt, they found these scarabs wrapped around the mummy bandages, wrapped within the bandages, placed over the heart, so that this little amulet would protect the heart in the afterlife. And these are actually, in archaeology, these are called diagnostic artifacts as well. And there's a whole typology of scarabs. And these are a way that we can determine the dating of different strata in an archaeological context, because we know that certain pharaohs had certain icons they used in different time periods. Anyway, so they're either a necklace or they're wrapped in the mummy bandages. So according to Acts chapter 7, when Stephen was before the Sanhedrin, he said something very interestingly. He made mention of Moses as being trained in all the culture and learning of the Egyptians, where he was a man of power and word and deed. So since Moses was an eyewitness to the Exodus, he would have insights into the Egyptian culture. But think about this also, John. Think about, not only was it a message to Pharaoh that you're going against your own religion, you're going against your own culture of hardening your heart, but it was also a warning, sort of a shot across the bow to the Israelites, because they were also, as we see, right after the Exodus, what do? They hardened their hearts. And in fact, there's a psalm that says, do not harden your hearts as it was in the days of the rebellion. Forget exactly which psalm it was. But this imagery of hardening of the heart is very important in Egyptian cosmology, Egyptian religion. And these little scarabs actually help protect the heart. So, so I'll stop there and see if you have any comments or questions.
I think that's fascinating to just take that little line, the hardening of the heart, which we might take as just an expression of, stubbornness, and then to realize that there actually is cultural Egyptian work going on. And so when God says, I will strike all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, both man and beast, and on all the gods of Egypt I will execute judgments. I am the Lord. This isn't just God saying, boy, I'm really a big deal. He's at war with the gods of Egypt, that these fallen angelic beings masquerading as more than they are. And Moses would have known that. He understands these things.
Absolutely.
And so when we're reading through the book of Exodus, it isn't just a story about how to be a better person. It isn't just about how you can find an exodus from your problems in your life. It's a book about God and what God has done. And so when you're reading through these stories and you find bits and pieces in archaeology that connect these dots, you're not supposed to say, oh, what does that have to do with me? You're supposed to look at that and say, isn't God glorious? Look at what the Lord has done. It should lead us into deeper worship. And so one of the things that I often hear from people is, because I am a Bible nerd and I love the text of Scripture, and they say, yeah, but what am I supposed to do with that? And I'm going to tell you what you're supposed to do with that. You're supposed to worship with that. You're supposed to praise God for what he's given to you. And so, does it change my attitude and what I do? Sure. I'm going to go out, hopefully, and be a good, upright, honest person and resist the darkness and the spiritual wickedness of the heavenly places, as Paul talks about, are just as much alive today as they were then. But I also, when I hit these moments, look to God and say, Lord, you showed me something here. You brought a friend and he explained this to me, or I'm seeing this with my own eyes in a museum maybe, and you just say, God, thank you for that. I understand. That's beautiful. I love it, man. Thanks. What other
That's awesome.
connections do you notice in the book of Exodus?
There's another one that's very interesting, and it's not, it comes through in the inscriptions and and understanding Egyptian culture. Let me just back up and say a couple of quick words, just as by way of just sort of bringing everybody up to par on the differences between archaeology and history per se. And I don't lay claim to originality on this concept, but I thought it was very good. Years ago, I heard a lecture by archaeologist Bill Deaver, Dr. William Deaver, and he said this, and this is the gist of kind of the difference between, what is the difference between archaeology and history? He says that archaeologists are materialists. We study artifacts, and historians study text. So whereas historians will study the past through written records, archaeologists study the past through artifacts. An artifact is anything that's been made or modified by a human. That could be a piece of pottery, that could be a scarab, that could be a sword, that could be a piece of armor, that could be a house. It could be a boat, it could be anything. So archaeologists try to reconstruct the past through artifacts. Well, that being said, though, there have been many artifacts that have been discovered by archaeologists that actually have writing on them. So in that case, there is sort of a bleed over between the work of the historian and the work of the archaeologist. The historian sort of looks at the bigger picture, and the archaeologist is more of a specialist. It used to be archaeology was more general than it is today. And now if you go into academic archaeology, you are going to get a very tiny little area of specialty, and that's what you're going to publish in. That's what you're going to be an expert on. I'm old school, and I sort of like the Albright Wright method, and that is more of a holistic, looking at not only the one little area of specialty that you are in, but also looking at the broader context of the linguistics, the theology, the historical background, the inscriptional evidence, the archaeological evidence, the pottery, typology, and now we have technology that's bringing in some new things. So that's a little background on it. So what I'm about to say next is is really about getting into, and again, we would not know this were it not for the work of Egyptologists translating texts in Egypt. And so let's go back to Egypt again. And so this is really fascinating, and I've got a couple of good books that I recommend to your listeners on this. Some of the things are in the book, some of the things are not in the book. John Currid, Currid, is called Ancient Egypt and the Old Testament. Fantastic book. Love that book. I've had my copy for quite a few years, and it is well worn and well marked. Dr. John Currid. John, I think his middle initial is D. You can get it on Amazon. It's Ancient Egypt in the Old Testament. And his other book that I was mentioning earlier, his work is called Against the Gods. It's about polemical theology. And it's really well worth the price. It's a small book, but very powerful. So check those out. But so to get into so it's a little bit of a background explanation. And the first thing I'll say is that names were important in Egypt. Your name was important. And especially if you were royalty, your name was very important. And one of the things that pharaohs would do is they had multiple names. In fact, they had 5 names. They had their birth name, their throne name, they had their Horus name, they had 3 or 4 different names. And of course, there were other deities as well. They had special names, son of this or son of that, all kinds of different epithets that went with the gods. And so one of the things that interested me years ago when I started looking at, I was actually teaching an Old Testament survey class, and this is kind of what got me to thinking about it. There was an interesting parallel between the idea of names and the importance of manipulating the Egyptian gods by saying their magical name, and the third commandment. The third commandment in Exodus 20 is do not take God's name in vain. In fact, what's interesting about that is, of course, Moses, is speaking to God, and he essentially says, when I go back to Egypt and I tell them, God sent me, what is your name? What do I tell them? Which I thought was very interesting. Like, why did he have to say that? Why did he have to ask that question? I mean, did I not know his name? And so that was interesting, number one. And the second thing is that, so if they didn't know his name, then how does the third commandment make any sense? If they didn't even know his name, how could they take his name in vain if they barely even knew his name? And what does that even mean, to take God's name in vain? We tend to think that it means, using God's name in a derogatory manner. And certainly that is not good, and that's, not honoring God, and it's to be, shunned by Christians and believers, around the world. But what I was trying to get at, what I really want to understand was what did that mean? What did that command mean to the original Israelites? And I eventually was able to connect the dots, and this idea of actually the Egyptians believed that if you actually you could manipulate some of the Egyptian gods and demons by actually saying their magical name, invoking their name. By invoking their name, you could pretty much get whatever you wanted. And I think what God is saying in the third commandment is that you cannot just say my name and I just give you whatever you want. Because you got to remember, the Israelites were in Egypt for several hundred years. They would have been, even no matter what view you have of the sojourn, there's 2 different views evangelicals have about the time the Israelites were in Egypt. One view is a couple hundred years. The other view is almost 400 years, not quite 400 years. And so at least a couple hundred years, if not more, they're in Egypt. And they would have begun to be influenced by Egyptian thinking on the nature of God. So essentially what God has to do is he is trying to re-educate his people as to who he is. And he's essentially saying, you just cannot say my name. You just can't just snap your fingers and say my magic name, or my name Yahweh, I am, and I just give you whatever. You're the God of Abraham. So God is trying to distance himself from the Egyptian gods. And I think, if you don't mind me trying to give a modern application, I think the danger of that and the modern application of the third commandment is really puts the wealth and prosperity preachers right in the crosshairs, because they kind of have this idea that language could sort of manipulate God, and that's exactly the third commandment's what it prohibits, is that you just can't say whatever you want to say and get your way, and that God he does whatever he wants. He is completely independent of human thought and action. He is sovereign over all human affairs. So especially it does make sense too when you look at the context of the first three commandments. Of course, the first one is no other gods before me. The second one is no graven images. God cannot be portrayed in a graven image. And then the third one, of course, is the taking the name in vain. And that makes sense in its Egyptian context, because, again, I think they would have been tempted to sort of invoke God's name to get their will done. So I think that's probably what it meant in its original context. And I think it's a really powerful way to understand it. And we see this, the power of the Egyptian gods. It took one day or so to get the Israelites out of Egypt, but it took 40 years to get Egypt out of Israel, and even still they still struggle with it. But even right there at the base of Mount Sinai, what is Aaron doing? They're ascribing their deliverance to a golden calf. So they're very thoroughly Egyptianized in their culture. So I think that's another good example of how archaeology and cultural studies give us some insights into the Old Testament.
Well, even the idea of a golden calf has major Egyptian connotations back to the Apis bull and all
Absolutely.
that stuff that's going on. Have you read Carmen Imes' book on bearing the name?
I have not read that book.
You would like it, man.
Is it good?
Yeah, it's about why Sinai still matters, and she talks about that same idea that it's about if you look at this in her mind, it's bearing the name. It's you're taking the name. If you're going to bear God's name, you need to do this right. And really, in my mind, taking what you just said makes me think of the Garden of Eden. It's, can you manipulate God to get what you want? Are you going to define good and evil for yourself, or are you a servant of the Most High? And you see this, and so God says, don't take my name in vain. Don't try to manipulate me into doing what you want. Instead, cultivate a heart that desires the will of God. I think in the New Testament it says, let this mind be in you, which was also in Christ Jesus. That's the goal. And it's not just a New Testament thing. It's not just something that you're going to read in Paul. You're going to read this in Moses. From the very beginning, God's will has been to have a relationship with mankind. That's why he made us, to be his image. And I just think it's so powerful when you're able not just to say, okay, this is a New Testament thing, but to recognize your whole Bible is working together, not against each other, but together to show you this big picture of Jesus and what God has been doing and is doing in our lives. And it's just wonderful to me to get these little pictures in the stories, and you say, this is the same thing shown to me differently. It's like I'm walking around an idea and seeing it from a different cultural angle. It's just so cool.
It's awesome. Yeah, amen, brother. Also, too, we, like the Israelites, are also susceptible to be affected by our own culture. And it's a lesson to us, don't let the thinking of the world affect how we view God. And that's exactly what happens in the church, is that people begin to take ideas outside, and it filters into the church and into, what we believe. And God, there's no one like him. There is, he is the one great I am of the universe, and he will not take second place. And, the greatest commandment is to love him with all of our heart, soul, mind, and strength, and to love our neighbor as ourselves. And it's a lifelong process, to be sure. It doesn't happen overnight. And like the Israelites, we are sort of, until we get to heaven, we are in the wilderness, and to learn, that man does not live by bread alone, but by every word that comes from the mouth of God. So it's something that we continue to work on ourselves. I got two more examples if we have time. If you want to get into those, we can. Go. So to go back to the divine, to go back to the name and the importance of the name, interestingly, the reason why people may see pictures of hieroglyphics on maybe documentary films, and they're very deeply carved into the stone. They're either in granite or they're in limestone or they're in some type of other material, very permanent material. And there's a reason for that. It's because they wanted their name to last forever. And also this whole idea about the name, there's a whole little there's a whole iceberg of information under that whole concept of the name. I mean, there are books written. I have a book right here in front of me on hieroglyphics about the name. There's 2 chapters on Egyptian naming and how important it was. And the name, and not just in metaphorical, but in a literal sense of the idea of the name. And they had different names and things like that. So the reason why they carved hieroglyphics so deeply into the stone is the permanence of the lasting of the name. They wanted their name, and if their name lasted forever, then their soul would be, of course, enduring in the afterlife, and their renown would go on forever. But not only that, the name would be transferred from dynasty to dynasty, or not dynasty, but father to son. And so you have a whole list of pharaohs who would basically pass down their name to their oldest son. And this is important because in Egyptian, it's called in scholarship they call it primogeniture, which basically is the importance of the firstborn, the basically priority of inheritance would go to the firstborn son. It was not only important in Egypt, it was also important in Mesopotamia. We see this with Abraham. Remember when, of course, Sarah, they're old, you're going to have a son. They laughed. Yeah, sure, right. And so Sarah actually gave Abraham her handmaiden, Hagar. And that was actually, just a little side note on that, that was actually important because that actually, we found in the Nuzi tablets, archaeologists discovered that was a thing in Mesopotamian culture, that if you were not able, if you're with your wife could not have a son, then you could actually have a concubine or a surrogate wife and have a male son. And that practice was also used in Egypt as well. So you have pharaohs who have a primary wife, their first wife, if you want to call it, their primary wife, the one that they married. And if the primary wife could, if they had a daughter, then he could actually, get with a concubine or a secondary wife to have a son, because the son was so important. And this gives us also some really interesting insights into the death of the firstborn. Essentially, to go back to this idea of polemics, God was basically saying to Pharaoh, I'm going to erase your name off the face of the earth. I mean, it's a pretty big slam. It's like an Elijah confrontation to the Pharaoh. And it was after that he let the Israelites go. So this coloring of the Egyptian coloring, to me, it is indirect but very powerful evidence of that the Exodus was written by an eyewitness, and that we see this very, very powerfully in the death of the firstborn and the lasting of the name of the Pharaoh. Basically, his name is now going to, and we know that. Well, this gets in another debate. One of the Exodus Pharaoh candidates that I hold, the one that I hold to, Amenhotep II, we know that his firstborn son did not succeed him because his second or third son, a pharaoh by the name of Thutmose IV, succeeded him. And the reason why we know that is because when the archaeologists excavated the Great Sphinx there in the Giza Plateau, they found a stele in between the paws of the Sphinx. And in the stele was actually, it's called the dream stele of Thutmose IV. It essentially said that he basically dreamed that he would be pharaoh, but his older brother was, of course, but his older brother died through some unforeseen fate that he did not name the fate, but he eventually became the pharaoh of all of Egypt. So it does match the biblical record. And so, yeah, that's one example. And then the final example I'll give, unless you want to get in more, but is to bring it back to Jesus, is to go. And again, this is in the not just in Exodus, but it's in Numbers 21. It's a very odd little episode in Numbers 21. And again, this gives us insight. Egypt gives us insight into this episode. So if you didn't know anything about Egypt and you read the episode, you may or may not, you could probably connect the dots, but when you see it in its Egyptian flavoring and its Egyptian culture, it really just pops out. It's sort of like watching a football game on a black and white television versus looking at it on a full color, high definition 4K,
Yeah.
And so the episode Numbers 21 is as the Israelites are they're wandering around in the desert and they begin to complain to Moses. They want to go back to Egypt. We're starving out here. We're tired of eating all this manna. We want to go back to Egypt where there's vegetables and leeks and garlics and onions and all this. So what does God do? God sends serpents, and the serpents begin to bite the people, and they start dying in the wilderness. So then they cry out to Moses, and then Moses goes to God, and God tells him to do something really odd. He says, I want you to make a bronze snake and place it on a staff, and those who look to the serpent will live. What in the world? Why? What's going on there? Well, as it turns out, John, the snake, the serpent, was one of the main gods of Egypt. In fact, the tutelary god, Egypt was divided into upper and lower. And it's kind of odd, a little bit of an explanation. So the Nile, because the Nile flows from the south to the north, the northern part of Egypt is called Lower Egypt because the Nile flows south or north, and it fans out into the Nile Delta. Well, the god overarching all of that land is a snake, and often you would see on a pharaoh's crown the cobra on that crown. So as they began to cry out to God, they want Egypt, and of course Egypt represents slavery and Egypt represents death. God gives them what they asked for. He gives them death. They asked for death, and so he says, you want to go back to slavery and death? Okay, I'll give you slavery and death through the serpent. But fast forward the clock now to John chapter 3. Jesus is talking to Nicodemus, and he says, Rabbi, we know you're a great teacher, come from God. Nobody can do these great things unless God were with him. And then he tells Nicodemus, you must be born again. Well, how can a man be born when he's old? But Jesus says, you are the rabbi, you are the teacher of Israel, and you don't understand these things. Just as Moses lifted up the serpent in the wilderness, so the Son of Man shall be lifted up, that those who look to him shall live. So the interesting thing is that the serpent literally represented not only Egypt and slavery and death, you could also even say it represented the serpent in the wilderness. It represented the devil, the embodiment of evil itself. And if you take the symbolism to its full conclusion, there's a passage, I think Paul wrote it, and I forgot if it's in Ephesians or Colossians, where it says, he made him who knew no sin to be sin for us, that we might become the righteousness of God in Christ Jesus. So Jesus literally became a serpent. He became the very emblem of death on the cross, that all those who look to him shall not die. And so very powerful imagery, but the imagery, it comes from Egypt. And the imagery is the serpent is actually right there on the staff, or of course Moses' staff turns into a serpent. And but the imagery there in Numbers 21 is very powerful.
Beautiful. So I think both of those examples that you just brought us should be very helpful to readers of the Bible today, because like you said a minute ago, there's a lot of debate about which Pharaoh is the Pharaoh of the Exodus, and it makes you wonder, well, why didn't they ever give the guy's name? Why don't they tell you the name of the Pharaoh? Surely Moses knew who it was, and for generations after that, they knew who it was. But knowing that cultural context of the Egyptian desire that this man who believed he was a god to make his name immortal, in the text, God takes his name away. It's not there.
Yeah.
And so it's, again, that idea of the Lord God triumphing over the powers of darkness, that he's not.
Absolutely.
You don't need, I think the Israelites at times are worshiping the Lord, and they're also worshiping these other gods, just trying to check all the boxes in case, this one is upset with me or that one. And instead you get the Lord saying, you don't need to pay off the demons. You don't need to work or give them anything. I am. I protect. I lay down my life and I take it up. And I think if you're reading your New Testament, you have to know your Old Testament, because it's going to give you the full, rich picture. It's going to help you understand, what is Jesus talking about, lifted up like a serpent? Well, he expects that you know these stories. And so the Old Testament isn't extra. It's not just, oh, by the way, here's some background information to help you. It's part of
Amen.
God's story. And so celebrate that. Worship the Lord by handling his word accurately and just enjoying the fullness of what God has given us. He's given us so much more than we need. And because of that,
Yes.
we ought to be thanking God and embracing and enjoying the goodness that God has brought to us. I can't thank you enough,
Amen.
Ted Wright from the epicarchaeology.org. You are a blessing, whether you realize it or not. I don't care what everyone says about you. You're good people.
Thank you, brother. I'm very grateful to be on. Thank you for having me.
If you'll just stick around for a minute, I'm going to link a couple of these books that you've mentioned here in our show notes so people can see those and go buy them. But tell us a little bit about your website before we go. Where can people go if they want to learn more about archaeology in the Bible?
Sure thing. Yes, they can go to epicarchaeology.org online. We have quite a few articles. We're working on the website, getting it a little, we changed web browsers a while back, and we are not browsers, but we hosting site. So we are tweaking it. It's going to be updated here fairly soon, maybe this summer. But there are articles on the website that they can check out. We're also on Facebook. So if you go up to Facebook and search Epic Archaeology, we should pop up there, and they can follow us and like us on Epic Archaeology. We're also on Instagram as well. And there's also a YouTube channel, and we're going to be putting some more podcasts out here pretty soon. But it's Epic Archaeology YouTube channel. And we have a podcast that we're going to crank back up here in the next couple of months called Monocle and Spade. And we interview some of the world's top archaeologists on the Bible and archaeology. So people can follow us on YouTube and subscribe to that, and hit the like button if you like the videos. We'd be very grateful for that.
Well, guys, you know you're on your phone way more than you need to be anyway. So you need to get over to epicarchaeology.com and redeem the time because the days are evil, right? All right. Well, brother,
Amen.
thank you
Amen.
so much for coming. And my friends, thank you for tuning in to the Two Trees podcast.